The morning sun had barely touched the horizon when Thomas Garrett stumbled out of the saloon in Deadwood, South Dakota. His clothes reeked of whiskey and cheap tobacco. Behind him, wrapped in a thin blanket, was his 3-year-old daughter, Emma. The child's face was dirty, her golden hair matted and tangled. She clutched a small wooden doll that her mother had made before dying of fever 6 months earlier. Thomas had once been a decent man. He worked at the lumber mill and came home every evening to his wife Sarah and little Emma. But when Sarah died, something inside him broke completely. He started drinking heavily, lost his job, and began gambling away what little money they had left. The other men in town whispered about him, and women pulled their children away when he passed by on the street. Emma had learned to stay quiet around her father. She knew that crying or asking for food only made him angry. Sometimes he would disappear for days, leaving her locked in their small cabin with nothing but stale bread and water. Other times he would drag her along to the saloons and gambling halls, making her sit in dark corners while he played cards and drank himself senseless. On this particular morning, Thomas had lost everything in a poker game. He owed money to dangerous men, the kind who broke bones when debts went unpaid. His mind was clouded with alcohol and desperation. He looked down at Emma, and instead of seeing his daughter, he saw only another burden he could not carry. The railroad tracks ran just outside of town, cutting through the wilderness toward the mining settlements further west. A train was scheduled to pass through at dawn, carrying supplies and passengers. Thomas knew the schedule well because he used to work loading cargo onto those trains. He picked up Emma and started walking toward the tracks. The little girl held tight to her doll and looked up at her father with confused eyes. She did not understand where they were going or why they were leaving so early. The morning air was cold and she shivered in her thin dress. When they reached the tracks, Thomas set Emma down on the wooden ties between the rails. The metal tracks stretched out in both directions, disappearing into the distance. Emma sat where he placed her, still clutching her doll. She thought perhaps they were waiting for the train, maybe going somewhere new. Thomas looked at his daughter one last time. For a brief moment, something flickered in his eyes, perhaps a memory of the man he used to be. But then he turned and walked away quickly, not looking back. Emma called out to him, her small voice breaking the morning silence. She called again and again, but Thomas kept walking until he disappeared into the trees. The little girl sat alone on the tracks as the sky grew lighter. She did not understand that her father had left her there to die. She kept thinking he would come back, that this was some kind of mistake. She hugged her doll tighter and began to sing a song her mother used to sing, her voice tiny against the vast wilderness around her. Miles away, moving silently through the forest, was a man named Two Ravens. He was a Lakota tracker, a man who could read the land like others read books. He could tell what animals had passed by the bend of a blade of grass, could predict weather by the way birds flew, and could track a man across solid rock. Two Ravens was in his 40th year, with long black hair streaked with gray and eyes that missed nothing. He had been tracking a wounded elk since before sunrise, following signs that would have been invisible to most men. But as he moved through the trees near the railroad tracks, he noticed something that made him stop. There were fresh boot prints in the soft earth, the stride uneven like someone drunk or in a hurry. And next to those prints were tiny marks, too small to be an adult. Two Ravens frowned and changed direction following the tracks. He moved quietly, his moccasins making no sound on the forest floor. Years of living close to the land had taught him to trust his instincts, and something about these tracks troubled him deeply. As he got closer to the railroad, he heard a sound that made his blood run cold. It was a child singing, the voice so young and innocent that it seemed impossible in this harsh wilderness. He moved faster now, pushing through the underbrush until he could see the tracks clearly. There, sitting in the middle of the rails with the morning sun lighting her golden hair, was Emma. She was still singing, though her voice had grown weaker. Two Ravens could see the exhaustion in her small body, the way she swayed slightly as she sat there. But then he heard something else that made him break into a run. In the distance, growing louder with each passing second, was the whistle of the approaching train. The engineer would never see the small child in time to stop. The train was still too far away, hidden by a bend in the tracks, but Two Ravens could hear it clearly. He burst from the trees and ran toward Emma, his long legs covering the ground in powerful strides. The little girl saw him and her eyes went wide with fear. She had been taught to fear Indians, had heard the stories that white settlers told their children, but she was too tired and confused to move. The train whistle blew again, much closer now. Two ravens could see the black smoke rising above the trees. He reached Emma just as the train came around the bend, its massive engine bearing down on them like a metal monster. The engineer saw them and pulled the brake lever hard, but everyone knew the train could not stop in time. Two ravens scooped Emma up in one swift motion and leaped from the tracks. He hit the ground hard, rolling to protect the child in his arms. The train roared past them, its wheels screaming as the engineer fought to slow the massive machine. Sparks flew from the rails and the wind from the train's passage whipped around them. When the train finally came to a complete stop several hundred yards down the track, Two Ravens was already disappearing back into the forest with Emma held securely against his chest. The little girl stared up at his face, no longer afraid. Something in his dark eyes told her that she was safe now, safer than she had been in many months. Behind them, the train crew was running back along the tracks, shouting and looking for bodies. They found only the small wooden doll that Emma had dropped, lying crushed between the rails. The engineer picked it up with shaking hands, believing they had just witnessed a terrible tragedy. But in the forest, Two Ravens carried Emma toward his camp, his mind already working through what he had seen. He knew the boot prints he had followed. He knew that someone had deliberately left this child to die on those tracks. And as he looked down at Emma's trusting face, something stirred in his chest that he had not felt in many years. It was a cold, focused anger that demanded justice. Two Ravens carried Emma through the forest for over an hour before reaching his camp. It was hidden in a small valley where a clear stream ran between tall pine trees. His shelter was simple but well made, constructed from branches and hides that blended perfectly with the surrounding wilderness. A small fire pit sat in the center, cold now but ringed with stones that had been carefully selected and placed. Emma had fallen asleep in his arms during the journey, exhausted from her ordeal. Two Ravens laid her gently on a pile of soft furs inside his shelter. She looked so small and fragile, her face still dirty and her dress torn in several places. He noticed bruises on her arms, some old and faded, others more recent. His jaw tightened as he recognized the signs of a child who had been roughly handled for some time. He built up the fire and heated water in a clay pot. When Emma woke up an hour later, she found herself in a strange place with the Indian man sitting nearby preparing food. She should have been terrified, but instead she felt an odd sense of calm. Two Ravens moved slowly and deliberately, never making sudden movements that might frighten her. He offered her a wooden cup filled with warm broth made from herbs and dried meat. Emma hesitated at first, then took the cup with both hands and drank greedily. She could not remember the last time she had eaten something warm. Two Ravens watched her carefully, noting how hungry she was, how her hands trembled as she held the cup. When she finished, he gently cleaned her face with a damp cloth. Emma flinched at first, expecting roughness, but his touch was surprisingly gentle. He spoke to her softly in his own language, words she did not understand but which somehow soothed her anyway. For the first time in months, Emma felt like someone actually cared whether she lived or died. As the day passed, Two Ravens began to piece together Emma's story. She was too young to explain everything clearly, but through simple questions and her halting answers, he learned about her father, the drinking, the gambling, and the morning he left her on the tracks. Each revelation made his expression darker. Two Ravens had a daughter once, many years ago. Her name had been Mourning Dove, and she would have been about 20 now if she had lived. But when she was just 7 years old, white soldiers had raided his village while most of the men were away hunting. Mourning Dove and her mother were killed, their bodies left lying in the dirt. Two Ravens had returned to find his entire world destroyed. He had spent years filled with hatred and anger, tracking down some of the soldiers responsible. But revenge had left him empty, and eventually he had withdrawn from both the white world and his own people, choosing to live alone in the wilderness. He thought he had buried all feeling, that his heart had turned to stone. But looking at this small white child who had been abandoned to die, he felt something crack inside that stone. That evening, as Emma slept, Two Ravens left the camp and returned to the railroad tracks. The moon was bright enough to see by, and his trained eyes quickly found the trail. He followed Thomas Garrett's boot prints back toward Deadwood, memorizing every detail of the man's stride and weight. He knew he could track this man anywhere now, across any terrain. He went into town carefully, staying in the shadows. Deadwood was rough and lawless, full of miners, gamblers, and men running from their pasts. Two Ravens listened to conversations in the saloons, learning what he needed to know. He heard men talking about Thomas Garrett, about the poker debt he owed, about how he had disappeared that morning. Some men said Thomas had probably run away to avoid paying what he owed. Others joked that he might have finally drunk himself to death in some alley. Not one person mentioned his daughter. Not one person seemed to have noticed or cared that a small child was missing. Two Ravens felt his anger grow colder and more focused. He learned that Thomas owed money to a man named Pike, a violent enforcer who worked for the gambling houses. Pike was known for his cruelty, and men who crossed him often ended up in the river with their throats cut. Two Ravens also learned that Thomas had been seen early that morning, walking toward the edge of town with a bundle under his arm. Back at the camp, Emma spent her days slowly recovering. Two Ravens fed her regularly, small amounts at first because her stomach had shrunk from months of neglect. He made her herbal teas to help her regain strength. He even fashioned her a new doll from soft leather and stuffed it with dried grass, carefully sewing a simple face onto it. Emma began to smile again, something she had not done since her mother died. She would sit by the fire and watch Two Ravens as he worked, tanning hides or sharpening his knife. Sometimes he would teach her simple things, showing her which plants were safe to eat and which tracks belonged to which animals. He spoke to her in English now, his words careful and deliberate. The child began to call him Raven, unable to pronounce his full name. He did not correct her. In fact, he found he liked the sound of his name on her lips. It reminded him of his daughter, of the family he had lost so long ago. 2 weeks passed in the camp. Emma grew stronger and healthier. Her bruises faded and color returned to her cheeks. She laughed sometimes, a sound that Two Ravens had not heard in his camp for many years. But even as he cared for the child, his mind was working, planning. He knew what had to be done about Thomas Garrett. The man had tried to murder his own daughter, had abandoned her to a horrible death on those tracks. In the world Two Ravens came from, such a crime demanded justice, not the white man's justice that came from courts and lawyers, but the old justice that came from action and consequence. During this time, Two Ravens also thought about Emma's future. He could not keep her hidden in the forest forever. She was a white child, and eventually she would need to return to her own people. But he could not bear the thought of giving her back to a world that had allowed her father to treat her so cruelly, to a town where no one had noticed or cared that she was missing. He decided he would find her a good home with people who would truly care for her. But first he had other business to attend to. Thomas Garrett had to answer for what he had done. And Pike, the man who had driven Thomas to such desperation with his gambling debts, also bore responsibility in Two Ravens' eyes. One evening, as Emma slept peacefully, Two Ravens prepared himself. He painted his face with traditional markings, something he had not done in many years. He checked his weapons, his knife sharp enough to split a hair, his bow strong and true. He was going hunting, but not for animals this time. He kissed Emma gently on the forehead, a gesture that surprised even himself. Then he disappeared into the night, moving like a shadow toward Deadwood. The time for planning was over. The time for justice had come. In town, Thomas Garrett was hiding in an abandoned warehouse near the edge of Deadwood. He had been there for 2 weeks, too afraid to show his face because of the money he owed to Pike. He survived on scraps he stole from behind restaurants and water from a rain barrel. Sometimes in his clearer moments he thought about Emma, but he told himself she was probably dead by now, and he forced the thoughts away with more alcohol whenever he could get it. Pike and his men were also in town, growing angrier each day that Thomas remained hidden. Pike had a reputation to maintain. If word got out that someone could skip out on a debt without consequences, others might try the same thing. He had men searching everywhere, promising a reward to anyone who could find Thomas Garrett. Two Ravens moved through Deadwood like a ghost. The town was loud and chaotic at night, full of drunken miners and gamblers, which made it easier for him to move unseen. He had tracked Thomas to the abandoned warehouse by following rumors and watching the patterns of movement around certain buildings. Men like Thomas always left signs if you knew how to read them. The warehouse was dark and quiet when Two Ravens approached. He circled it slowly, noting every entrance and exit, every window and weak point in the structure. His years of hunting had taught him patience. He did not rush. Instead, he settled into the shadows across the street and waited, watching. Just before midnight, Thomas emerged briefly to relieve himself in the alley. Two ravens saw him clearly in the moonlight, noting how the man had deteriorated even further. His clothes were filthy, his face unshaven and hollow. But what struck two ravens most was that Thomas showed no sign of grief or guilt. He looked worried only for himself, afraid only of the men he owed money to. Two ravens could have killed him right there in that alley. One arrow, silent and quick, and Thomas would never hurt another child. But that would have been too easy, too quick. Two ravens wanted Thomas to understand what he had done, to face the magnitude of his crime before justice was delivered. He waited until Thomas went back inside, then moved to the warehouse door. The lock was old and rusty, easy to force open quietly. Two ravens slipped inside and let his eyes adjust to the darkness. The warehouse was full of old crates and broken equipment, casting strange shadows in the moonlight that filtered through dirty windows. Thomas was sleeping in a corner on a pile of old canvas. He had one arm thrown over his face, his breathing heavy with exhaustion and alcohol. Two ravens moved silently across the floor, making no more sound than a leaf falling. He stood over Thomas for a long moment, looking down at the man who had tried to kill Emma. Then he placed his hand firmly over Thomas's mouth and pressed the point of his knife against the man's throat. Thomas woke instantly, his eyes wide with terror. He tried to struggle, but two ravens held him firmly, the knife point drawing a small bead of blood. Two ravens spoke quietly, his voice cold as winter wind. He told Thomas that he knew what he had done. He described finding Emma on the tracks, described her fear and confusion, described how close she had come to being torn apart by the train. Thomas's eyes grew wider with each word, and two ravens could smell the fear pouring off him. Thomas tried to speak, tried to make excuses, but two ravens pressed the knife harder against his throat, silencing him. He told Thomas that Emma was alive and safe, that she would never be returned to him, that he would never see her again. He told Thomas that he was going to pay for what he had done, but not with a quick death. Two ravens had planned this carefully. He knew that killing Thomas outright would solve nothing, and might bring trouble to Emma later if questions were asked. Instead, he had a different kind of justice in mind, one that would mark Thomas forever and let everyone know what kind of man he was. He bound Thomas's hands tightly behind his back and gagged him with a strip of cloth. Then he dragged him out of the warehouse and through the dark streets to the edge of town where the forest began. Thomas struggled and tried to make noise, but two ravens moved too quickly and efficiently, keeping to the shadows. In a small clearing, two ravens built a fire. He heated his knife in the flames until the blade glowed red. Thomas's eyes bulged with terror as he watched, making muffled sounds through the gag. Two ravens told him this was mercy compared to what he deserved, that in the old ways he would have faced far worse for attempting to murder his own child. When the blade was hot enough, two ravens cut away Thomas's shirt and pressed the flat of the heated knife against his chest over his heart. Thomas screamed through the gag as the metal seared his flesh, leaving a permanent mark. Two ravens had carved a symbol into the blade first, and now it was burned into Thomas's skin forever. It was the Lakota symbol for betrayer, for one who abandons family. After it was done, two ravens left Thomas tied to a tree at the edge of town. He placed a sign around his neck written in English that said simply, "This man left his 3-year-old daughter on the train tracks to die." Two ravens knew Thomas would be found in the morning, and that everyone in Deadwood would see the mark and read the sign. But Two Ravens was not finished. Pike, the gambling boss, was next on his list. While Pike had not directly harmed Emma, Two Ravens believed he shared responsibility. The gambling debts, the threats, the culture of violence Pike created had pushed Thomas to his desperate act. Men like Pike created the conditions where fathers became monsters. Pike operated out of a large saloon called the Lucky Strike, a 3-story building in the center of town. He had an office on the top floor where he conducted his business, surrounded by armed men who served as his personal guards. Getting to him would be far more difficult than dealing with Thomas. Two Ravens spent the next 2 days observing Pike's routines and the patterns of his guards. He watched from rooftops and alleyways, noting when shifts changed, where the weaknesses in security were, and what time Pike usually retired for the night. He was in no hurry. Patience was a weapon as sharp as any knife. He learned that Pike had a habit of stepping out onto a balcony late at night to smoke cigars and look over the town he believed he controlled. The balcony faced a narrow alley and was partially hidden from the street by a sign. Two Ravens smiled grimly when he discovered this. It was perfect. On the third night after marking Thomas, Two Ravens positioned himself on the roof of the building, across from the lucky strike. He had his bow and 3 arrows, each one carefully crafted and perfectly balanced. He had hunted with these arrows for years, and they had never failed him. Just past midnight, as expected, Pike stepped out onto his balcony. He was a large man, well-fed and confident, dressed in expensive clothes that marked him as successful. He lit his cigar and stood at the railing, looking down at Deadwood with the satisfied expression of a man who believed he owned everything he could see. Two Ravens drew his bow slowly, the movement practiced and smooth. He aimed carefully, accounting for wind and distance. His first arrow was not meant to kill, only to send a message. He released the string and the arrow flew true, striking the wooden beam right next to Pike's head, missing him by less than an inch. Pike jumped back with a startled curse, dropping his cigar. Before he could call for help, Two Ravens sent his second arrow, this one pinning Pike's expensive coat sleeve to the door frame behind him. Pike was trapped, unable to move forward or back without tearing his coat or potentially putting himself in line for another arrow. Two Ravens appeared at the edge of the opposite roof, silhouetted against the moon so Pike could see him clearly. He called out in a voice loud enough to carry, but not so loud as to alert the entire building. He told Pike that he knew about Thomas Garrett, about the gambling debts that had driven a man to try murdering his own child. Pike stammered, trying to deny responsibility. But Two Ravens cut him off. He told Pike that from now on, if anyone else in Deadwood suffered because of gambling debts to the point where they harmed innocents, Pike would answer for it personally. He told Pike that he would be watching, that he could strike at any time from anywhere, and that Pike's guards could not protect him from arrows in the dark. To prove his point, Two Ravens fired his third arrow. It struck the cigar that Pike had dropped, pinning it to the wooden boards of the balcony between Pike's feet. The shot was impossibly precise, and Pike understood the message clearly. This man could have killed him 3 times over, but had chosen not to. The next time, he might not be so merciful. Two Ravens disappeared from the rooftop before Pike could even call for his men. By the time guards burst onto the balcony, there was no sign of the archer except for 3 arrows and a terrified Pike who was shouting confused orders about finding an Indian who could shoot like a demon. By morning, news of what had happened spread through Deadwood like wildfire. Thomas Garrett had been found at dawn, still tied to the tree with the sign around his neck and the horrible burn mark on his chest. The doctor who examined him confirmed that the symbol had been deliberately branded into his flesh, and that it would scar permanently. Thomas was babbling about an Indian tracker who had found his daughter alive, but most people thought he was delusional from fear and pain. The story of Pike's encounter spread even faster, growing more dramatic with each telling. Some said it was a Lakota warrior seeking revenge. Others claimed it was a ghost or a spirit of vengeance. Pike himself was uncharacteristically quiet about the details, though he doubled his guards and became noticeably more paranoid about standing near windows or in open spaces. The marshal of Deadwood, a tired man named Cobb who had seen too much violence in his years, investigated both incidents. He questioned Thomas extensively, but the man was too broken to make much sense. Thomas kept crying about his daughter, sometimes claiming she was dead, other times saying she had been rescued by an Indian. The marshal could not determine which version was true, or if any of it was real. Marshal Cobb had heard rumors about Thomas abandoning his daughter, but no one had actually seen the child in weeks, and Thomas had no other family in town to report her missing. The marshal was troubled by the whole affair, but without a body or a clear witness, he could not prove a murder had been attempted. He did notice that Pike had suddenly become very generous with his gambling debts, giving several men extra time to pay or even forgiving smaller amounts entirely. Back in the forest, Emma had grown stronger and happier each day. She followed Two Ravens everywhere, chattering in her little girl voice about everything she saw. She learned the names of plants and animals, learned how to walk quietly through the forest, and learned to recognize the calls of different birds. Two Ravens found himself teaching her things he had once taught his own daughter, and the pain of those memories mixed with an unexpected joy. But two ravens knew this could not last forever. Emma was a white child, and she would need more than a life in the wilderness. She would need education, a proper home, a place in her own people's world. The thought of letting her go caused an ache in his chest, but he knew it was necessary. He began asking discreet questions in the nearby settlements, learning about families who might provide a good home. He was looking for people with genuine kindness, people who had lost children of their own and might understand the gift they were being offered. It had to be the right family, people who would love Emma as she deserved to be loved. It took 3 weeks of careful observation, but two ravens finally found what he was looking for. In a small settlement called Pine Ridge, about 30 miles from Deadwood, lived a couple named Samuel and Martha Henderson. They ran a general store and were known throughout the area as honest, kind people. They had lost their only daughter to scarlet fever 2 years earlier, and Martha still wore black in mourning. Two ravens watched them for several days, noting how gently Samuel spoke to the children who came into their store, how Martha would slip extra candy to kids whose families were struggling. He saw the sadness that never quite left their eyes, the way they would sometimes pause and stare at nothing, clearly thinking of the child they had lost. One evening, two ravens wrote a letter in careful English. He explained that he had rescued a 3-year-old girl who had been abandoned by her father. He did not mention his name or exactly how he had found Emma, only that she needed a good home with people who would truly care for her. He described Emma's nature, her sweetness and intelligence, and he included a small lock of her golden hair tied with a leather cord. The next day, he left the letter at the Hendersons' door before dawn, weighted down with a smooth river stone. Then he retreated to the forest to watch and wait. He saw Samuel find the letter as the sun rose, saw him read it with growing emotion, then rush inside to show Martha. Through their window, two ravens could see them reading the letter together, Martha's hand shaking as she held the lock of golden hair. For the next hour, Samuel and Martha talked intensely. Two ravens could not hear their words, but he could read their body language, the way hope and fear and longing played across their faces. Finally, they sat down together and Martha began to cry, but these were not tears of sadness. Samuel held her, and two ravens knew his instincts had been correct. These were good people. That afternoon, Samuel and Martha posted a notice in their store window. It simply said that they were willing to provide a home for the child mentioned in the letter they had received, and that whoever had written the letter should bring the child to them any evening after the store closed. They would ask no questions and would love the child as their own. Two ravens returned to his camp and looked at Emma, who was playing with her leather doll by the fire. She had been with him for over a month now, and saying goodbye would be one of the hardest things he had ever done. But he knew it was right. She deserved more than a life hiding in the wilderness. She deserved a real childhood, with other children to play with, proper food and shelter, and eventually an education. That evening, he sat Emma down and tried to explain in simple words that she was going to live with new parents who would take care of her. Emma's face crumpled and she grabbed onto his arm, saying she wanted to stay with him. Two ravens felt his heart break, but he kept his voice steady and gentle. He told her that she would like her new home, that Samuel and Martha were good people who would love her very much. He promised that he would watch over her from a distance, that he would always make sure she was safe even if she could not see him. Emma cried into his chest, and two ravens held her, stroking her golden hair and fighting back his own tears. He made her a special gift for her journey. It was a small leather pouch on a cord, meant to be worn around the neck. Inside he placed a carved wooden bird, a raven that he had spent hours crafting and smoothing until it was perfect. He told Emma that whenever she felt scared or alone, she should hold the raven and remember that someone was watching over her. The next evening, two ravens dressed Emma in the best clothes he could find, items he had traded for in various settlements. He braided her hair carefully, the way he remembered braiding his daughter's hair so many years ago. Emma was quiet, understanding that something important was happening even if she did not fully comprehend all of it. They walked through the forest as the sun set, Emma holding two ravens' hand tightly. When they reached Pine Ridge, he waited until full darkness before approaching the Hendersons' home. Lights glowed warmly in the windows, and two ravens could see Samuel and Martha sitting in their living room, clearly waiting and hoping. He knocked on the door 3 times, then stepped back into the shadows with Emma. Samuel opened the door cautiously, and his eyes went immediately to the little girl standing on his porch. Emma looked up at him with her big eyes, clutching the leather pouch around her neck. Martha appeared behind Samuel, and when she saw Emma, she made a small sound of joy and wonder. She knelt down slowly, holding out her arms, and spoke softly to Emma, telling her she was welcome and safe. Emma looked back at the shadows where 2 ravens stood, seeking reassurance. 2 ravens nodded once, even though Emma could barely see him in the darkness. She understood. She turned back to Martha and took a tentative step forward, then another. Martha's eyes were streaming with tears as Emma walked into her arms. Samuel knelt beside them, wrapping both his wife and the little girl in a gentle embrace. 2 ravens watched from the darkness as they brought Emma inside, as Martha held her and Samuel brought warm milk and cookies. He watched as they showed her the room that would be hers, a room that had once belonged to their lost daughter but which they had carefully prepared for a new child. He watched Emma touch the toys and books, saw her begin to smile again even through her tears. Only when he was certain that Emma was settled and safe did 2 ravens turn away. He moved back into the forest like a shadow, his heart both empty and full at the same time. He had done what needed to be done. Emma would have a good life now, a chance to grow up safe and loved. The weeks following Emma's placement with the Hendersons were difficult for 2 ravens. He found himself returning to the empty camp and feeling the silence in a way he had not felt in years. The firs where Emma had slept seemed to hold her shape. The fire pit where she had sat and laughed felt cold even when flames burned in it. He had grown used to her presence, to the sound of her voice and the way she would run to show him things she had discovered in the forest. But he did not allow himself to wallow in loneliness. Instead, he kept his promise to watch over Emma from a distance. Once a week, he would travel to Pine Ridge under cover of darkness and observe the Henderson home. He watched Emma playing in the yard, growing healthier and happier with each passing week. He saw Samuel teaching her to read, pointing at letters in books while Emma concentrated with her small face serious and focused. He saw Martha brushing Emma's hair and singing to her before bed. The Hendersons never knew they were being watched, and that was how 2 ravens wanted it. He was a ghost, a guardian they would never see. Emma had settled into her new life remarkably well. Children were resilient, and the Hendersons showered her with the kind of stable, gentle love she had never known with her real father. Meanwhile, in Deadwood, the aftermath of 2 ravens' actions continued to ripple outward. Thomas Garrett had become a pariah in the town. Everyone had seen the brand on his chest and read the sign. Even the roughest miners and gamblers were disgusted by what he had done. Men who had committed terrible crimes themselves still had a code, and abandoning a child to die on railroad tracks violated every principle they held. Thomas tried to leave Deadwood, but word had spread to neighboring towns. The brand on his chest was impossible to hide, and people recognized it as a mark of shame. He was turned away from hotels, refused service in stores, and threatened by locals wherever he went. Eventually, he was forced to live like an animal, sleeping in forests and stealing to survive. The whiskey that had once dulled his conscience became impossible to find without money or welcome in any establishment. One night, desperate and half-mad from isolation, Thomas made his way to Pine Ridge. He had heard rumors that his daughter was alive and living somewhere in the area. Some part of him, perhaps the last remnant of the man he used to be, wanted to see her one more time, or perhaps he hoped to use her to gain sympathy and rebuild his shattered reputation. 2 ravens had been tracking Thomas for days, sensing the man's movements even from a distance. He knew Thomas was headed toward Pine Ridge before Thomas himself fully understood where he was going. The tracker positioned himself between the town and the direction Thomas was traveling, waiting in the darkness like a patient predator. Thomas stumbled through the forest at night, drunk on cheap whiskey he had stolen from an unattended wagon. His clothes were rags now, his face covered in an unkempt beard, his eyes wild and desperate. He had lost everything, and the brand on his chest throbbed constantly, a permanent reminder of his shame. When Thomas emerged from the trees onto the path leading to Pine Ridge, 2 ravens stepped out in front of him. The moonlight illuminated both men clearly. Thomas froze, recognition dawning on his face even through the fog of alcohol. This was the Indian who had marked him, who had taken his daughter. Thomas opened his mouth to speak, perhaps to curse or plead or threaten, but Two Ravens held up one hand for silence. He spoke in a low, firm voice that carried absolute authority. He told Thomas that Emma was safe and happy, living with people who loved her properly. He told Thomas that if he ever came near Pine Ridge again, if he ever tried to contact Emma or disrupt her new life, there would be consequences far worse than a brand. Two Ravens made it clear that he would be watching always. He described exactly where the Henderson home was, proving he knew where Emma lived, and he promised that any attempt by Thomas to approach would be seen and stopped. He told Thomas that the best thing, the only decent thing he could ever do for his daughter, was to disappear completely and let her believe he was dead. Thomas tried to argue, tried to claim some parental right, but his words were weak and hollow. Deep down he knew the truth. He had forfeited any claim to Emma the moment he placed her on those tracks. Two Ravens simply stared at him with those dark, unforgiving eyes until Thomas's voice trailed off into silence. Finally, Two Ravens gave Thomas a choice. He could leave immediately, head west toward California or south toward Mexico, anywhere far from South Dakota, or he could try to stay, and Two Ravens would ensure he never bothered Emma or anyone else again. The implied threat was clear, and Thomas was too broken and afraid to challenge it. Thomas chose to leave. Two Ravens watched him stumble back into the forest, heading west this time, away from Pine Ridge and Emma. The tracker followed at a distance for 2 days, making sure Thomas kept going and did not circle back. Finally satisfied that Thomas was truly leaving the territory, Two Ravens let him go. He suspected Thomas would drink himself to death within a few years anyway, lost and alone in some distant place where no one knew his name or his crimes. With Thomas gone for good, Two Ravens returned to watching over Emma. Months passed, then a year. Emma grew taller and stronger. Her golden hair, now always clean and neatly braided, shone in the sunlight as she played. She started attending the small school in Pine Ridge, where she proved to be a bright and eager student. The Hendersons formally adopted her, giving her their name. She became Emma Henderson, and her past as Emma Garrett faded like a bad dream. But Emma never forgot the man who had saved her. She kept the leather pouch with the carved raven close always, wearing it under her dress where no one else could see. Sometimes, when she was alone, she would take out the small wooden bird and hold it, remembering the gentle tracker who had pulled her from the railroad tracks and cared for her in the forest. She tried to tell Samuel and Martha about Two Ravens, but she was so young when it happened that the memories had become dreamlike and confused. She could remember strong arms carrying her, a campfire in the forest, and a kind face with dark eyes, but the details were hazy. The Hendersons listened patiently and assumed she was talking about a dream or mixing up memories with stories she had heard. Two Ravens continued his solitary life in the wilderness, hunting and trapping, living according to the old ways, but his purpose had changed. Before Emma, he had been simply existing, going through the motions of survival without any real connection to the world. Now he felt he had a reason to remain, a duty to fulfill. As long as Emma was in Pine Ridge, he would watch over her from the shadows. He saw her 10th birthday, saw Samuel and Martha throw her a party with other children from town. He saw her learn to ride a horse, saw her help in the general store, saw her grow from a little girl into a young woman with intelligence and kindness that reminded him painfully of his lost daughter, Mourning Dove. The years passed quietly. Pike had indeed changed his ways, becoming less violent in his dealings and more reasonable about gambling debts. The story of the Phantom Archer had become legend in Deadwood, whispered about in saloons as a cautionary tale. No one knew it had been Two Ravens, and he preferred it that way. As Emma grew older, she began to ask more questions about her past. The Hendersons, who had always been honest with her, told her what little they knew. They explained that she had been rescued by someone who cared about her safety and brought her to them. They showed her the letter that Two Ravens had written, which they had kept all these years. Emma studied the letter carefully, touching the words with her fingers. The handwriting was precise but showed the effort of someone not completely comfortable writing in English. She treasured this letter as much as her carved raven, both tangible connections to the mysterious person who had saved her life. On her 16th birthday, Emma made a decision. She wanted to find the man who had rescued her and thank him properly. Martha and Samuel were worried about this plan, but they understood her need for answers. They helped her gather information, asking old-timers in Pine Ridge and nearby towns if anyone remembered stories about a Lakota tracker from that time. Slowly, pieces of the story came together. An elderly trapper remembered seeing a Lakota man living alone in the forest north of Pine Ridge years ago. A man with a reputation for amazing tracking skills. A former soldier recalled hearing about an Indian called Two Ravens who could track anything. The fragments of information painted a picture, but no one knew where Two Ravens was now or if he was even still alive. Emma spent weeks searching for any trace of Two Ravens. She rode out into the wilderness with Samuel, visiting old camps and talking to anyone who might have information. Most trails were cold, the years having erased footprints and obscured memories, but Emma was determined, driven by a need that she could not fully explain even to herself. Two Ravens, of course, knew about her search. He watched from a distance as she questioned people, as she rode through forest calling out, asking if anyone knew a man named Two Ravens. Part of him wanted to reveal himself, to let her see that he was still watching over her, still keeping his promise. But another part of him knew that their paths were meant to remain separate. She had her life now, a good life with people who loved her. He was a ghost from her past, a memory best left undisturbed. One evening, Emma rode alone to the place where the old railroad tracks ran through the wilderness. The line had been abandoned years ago, the mining towns further west having dried up and been deserted. Nature was slowly reclaiming the tracks, grass growing between the wooden ties, rust coating the metal rails. She dismounted and walked along the tracks, trying to remember that morning so long ago. The memories were fragments like pieces of a broken mirror. She remembered being cold and afraid. She remembered singing to herself. She remembered strong arms lifting her away from danger at the very last moment. Emma sat down between the rails in the exact spot where Two Ravens had found her. She took out the carved raven from her pouch and held it up to the fading sunlight. Tears ran down her cheeks as she spoke aloud, not knowing if anyone could hear her but needing to say the words anyway. She thanked the man who had saved her. She told him that she had a wonderful life because of what he did, that Samuel and Martha were the best parents anyone could ask for. She said that she understood why he had not revealed himself, but that she wished she could see him one more time to tell him in person how grateful she was. She said that she would never forget him, that the carved raven would be treasured always. In the trees 50 yards away, Two Ravens stood silently listening to every word. His weathered face was wet with tears he had not shed in decades. He had aged considerably in the 16 years since that morning on the tracks. His hair was now more gray than black, his movements slower, his body bearing the weight of many hard years. He wanted desperately to step out of the forest, to let Emma see him, to accept her thanks and tell her how proud he was of the person she had become. But something held him back. Perhaps it was the knowledge that their story had already reached its natural ending, that day he left her with the Hendersons. Perhaps it was the understanding that some acts of kindness were meant to remain anonymous, their power preserved by mystery rather than diminished by explanation. As the sun set, Emma finally stood up and brushed the dirt from her dress. She placed the carved raven back in its pouch and looked around one last time, her eyes scanning the forest. For just a moment, Two Ravens thought she looked directly at where he stood hidden in the shadows, and he wondered if somehow she sensed his presence. Then Emma smiled, a peaceful smile that lit up her face. She walked back to her horse mounted up and rode slowly back toward Pine Ridge. Two Ravens watched her go until she disappeared from sight. Then he turned and walked deeper into the wilderness, his heart both heavy and light at the same time. The years continued to pass. Emma married a good man, a schoolteacher named Robert who treated her with kindness and respect. Samuel and Martha lived to see their adopted daughter happy and settled, and they passed away peacefully within months of each other when Emma was 23. She inherited their general store and ran it successfully, becoming a respected member of the Pine Ridge community. Emma and Robert had 3 children, 2 boys and a girl. Emma named her daughter Sarah, after the mother she barely remembered, and she told her children stories about courage, kindness, and the mysterious guardian who had once saved a little girl left to die on railroad tracks. The stories became family legend, passed down with the carved wooden raven that Emma kept in a place of honor in their home. Two Ravens continued to watch over Emma from a distance, though less frequently as the years passed. He saw her children born, saw her prosper and age gracefully. He saw that she was truly happy, and that was enough for him. The purpose that had kept him going for so long was fulfilled. Emma was safe, loved, and living a good life. In his 70th year, Two Ravens felt his strength beginning to fade. The winters were harder now, the hunting more difficult. His joints ached with old wounds and the burden of age. He knew his time was coming to an end, and he found he was not afraid. He had lived longer than most men of his generation, and he had done something meaningful with the extra years given to him. On a cold autumn morning, Two Ravens made his way one final time to a hill overlooking Pine Ridge. From this vantage point, he could see Emma's home, could see smoke rising from the chimney, could see her children playing in the yard while she hung laundry on a line. The scene was peaceful and perfect, a snapshot of the life he had helped make possible. He sat down beneath a large oak tree, his back against the rough bark, and watched the town below. His breathing was labored now, each breath requiring more effort than the last. But he felt no regret, no fear. He had avenged Mourning Dove in his own way, not through violence but through saving another child who might otherwise have been lost. He had found redemption in protecting Emma, in giving her the life his own daughter never got to live. As the sun climbed higher, Two Ravens closed his eyes. His hand moved to touch a small leather pouch he wore around his own neck, one that contained a lock of Mourning Dove's hair, preserved all these years. In his other hand he held his knife, the same knife he had used to mark Thomas Garrett, the knife that had protected Emma in those first dangerous weeks. His last thoughts were of his daughter running through their village as a child, laughing and carefree, and of Emma, golden-haired and bright-eyed, sitting by his campfire and calling him Raven. The two images merged together in his fading mind, and he smiled peacefully. Two Ravens died as he had lived his final years, alone but not lonely, his purpose fulfilled. The wind carried his spirit away as his body remained beneath the oak tree, facing toward the town he had protected from shadows. It was 2 days before a hunter found his body. The man recognized the traditional Lakota clothing and the weathered features of an elder. He brought word to Pine Ridge where such things were reported. Emma heard about the discovery, and something in her heart knew immediately who it was, though she had no logical reason to be certain. She rode up to the hill with Robert, and when she saw the body beneath the oak tree, she felt a profound sense of recognition, despite the many years that had passed. This was him, the man who had saved her. She could not explain how she knew, but she was absolutely certain. The authorities wanted to bury him in the town cemetery, but Emma insisted on a different arrangement. She purchased the hill where he had died and had him buried there beneath the oak tree, with a view of the valley and Pine Ridge below. She commissioned a simple stone marker that read, "Two Ravens, Lakota Tracker and Guardian. He saved the lost." Emma visited the grave often over the remaining years of her life. She would sit beneath the oak tree and tell Two Ravens about her children, about the store, about the small joys and struggles of daily life. She would take out the carved raven and hold it while she talked, feeling connected across the years to the man who had shown her that kindness could come from unexpected places. The story of Two Ravens and the child on the tracks became legendary in Pine Ridge and the surrounding territories. People told it in different ways, adding their own embellishments and interpretations. Some said he was a vengeful spirit, others claimed he was an angel sent by God. A few insisted he was simply a good man who did what was right when it mattered most. But Emma knew the truth. He was all of those things and none of them. He was simply Two Ravens, a man who had lost everything and found purpose in protecting someone else's child. He was proof that one act of courage, one moment of choosing right over wrong, could change the course of a life forever. Years later, when Emma herself was old and gray, she gathered her grandchildren around her fireplace. She took out the carved wooden raven, now worn smooth by decades of handling, and told them the true story of the man who saved her. She explained how evil actions have consequences, how Thomas had been marked and driven away, how Pike had learned to be less cruel. But most importantly, she taught them that there are people in the world who watch over others, who protect the vulnerable, who stand against injustice even when no one is watching. She told them that we all have a choice between being like Thomas, who chose cowardice and cruelty, or like Two Ravens, who chose courage and compassion. She taught them that real strength is not found in power over others, but in protecting those who cannot protect themselves. When Emma died peacefully at the age of 78, surrounded by her children and grandchildren, she was buried on the same hill as two ravens, just a few yards from his grave beneath the oak tree. Her family honored her wish to be laid to rest near the man who had given her a second chance at life. The two graves stood together on that hill for generations, a silent testament to an unlikely bond forged in a moment of crisis. The wooden raven was buried with Emma, placed in her hand so that even in death she held the symbol of her guardian. The hill became a place of pilgrimage for people seeking hope, for those who had suffered injustice, for parents who wanted to teach their children about courage and redemption. The oak tree continued to grow, its branches spreading wide to shelter both graves, and people said that on quiet mornings, if you listened carefully, you could hear the call of ravens in the distance, watching over the valley below just as two ravens had watched over Emma so many years ago. The land itself seemed to remember the story. The old railroad tracks, long since removed, left only faint impressions in the earth, a reminder of how close Emma had come to tragedy. But the hill where two ravens and Emma rested became a symbol of something more powerful than tragedy, a symbol of redemption, protection, and the enduring power of one person's choice to do what is right. And so the legend lived on, passed from generation to generation, changing slightly with each telling but always carrying the same essential truth, that in a world of darkness, there are still those who stand as guardians, who save the lost, who seek justice for the wronged. The story of two ravens and the little one left on the tracks became more than just history. It became a promise that even in our darkest moments, even when we are most alone and vulnerable, there may be someone watching over us, ready to step from the shadows when we need them most.